I saw part of the message.
I seem to have found it.
General Kenobi, years ago you served my father in the Clone Wars. Now he begs you to help him in his struggle against the Empire.
The Clone Wars. Originally mentioned in something of a throwaway line by Princess Leia in A New Hope, this war was shrouded in mystery as a part of the history of Star Wars. All we knew is that Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Bail Organa all served in some capacity during the war. However, that was enough. Fans speculated for years about this conflict. What was it about? Who was on which side? How did it lead to the fall of Anakin Skywalker and the rise of the Empire? Finally, in 2002, George Lucas gave us the answer. Boy, was it disappointing. So here we go with my list of things wrong with the Clone Wars. No, not the cartoon. That was actually really good. If I understand it correctly, Palpatine's plot was as follows. Gain power by becoming Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic. Create a war by playing both sides against each other. Use the war as a reason to amass power to himself. Use the clones he created for one side of the war to wipe out the Jedi. With opposition largely eliminated, take power. The real question? Why is this plan so convoluted? And given how convoluted it is, why does it take so long? This plot is very specific, so the risk of something going wrong goes up significantly the more time it takes. First off, a certain degree of luck is needed for Palpatine to gain power in the first place. If he doesn't get power, his plan goes nowhere. Not enough explanation is given regarding his rise to power or why people seem to think him qualified for the position of Chancellor. Well, I understand that he instigated the Naboo crisis to boot Valorum and generate sympathy votes for himself. Why the Senate turned to him is a mystery. Then, creating civil war in the Republic. In the long history of civil wars, the only thing they've ever served to do is divide people. Even when warring sides have a reconciliation, there's still animosity that lasts for decades after. Yet, Palpatine tries to use the general chaos of the situation to make a unity government. Palpatine uses a civil war to springboard the ultimate unification of the galaxy into the Galactic Empire. It may not be impossible, but it's highly improbable. There would be hundreds of worlds still bitterly resenting their loss in the war. Many of those worlds would still have armies of battle droids and fleets to protect themselves with. It's not unreasonable to think that they would resist the Republic or Empire in the aftermath of the main conflict, more so when Palpatine declared himself Emperor. Rather than unifying the galaxy with civil war, Palpatine would simply set his new government up for years of warfare with warlord groups scattered across 100,000 light-years. Rather than unity, there would be chaos. Finally, there's the matter of the clones themselves, several million potential liabilities. As the Clone Wars cartoon series eventually demonstrated, it was a small chip in the brains of the clones that caused them to be obedient to Order 66. Given how many clones were injured and killed in the conflict, it is reasonable that someone at some point might have discovered one of these devices. But of course, no one does because... This point might sound a bit familiar if you've ever watched the Red Letter Media reviews of the prequels, but no discussion of the prequels or the Clone Wars themselves is complete without mentioning this aspect. Why does no one think to ask questions about the circumstances surrounding the war? Note, I am aware that some of this is present in source material, which is referenced, but some of these questions ought to have been answered within the movies. Why does Dooku leave the Jedi Order? Is no one close enough to him to investigate this further, try to understand him better? Why then does Dooku reappear 10 years later at the head of a political movement? In fact, what generated the Separatist Movement in the first place? Why is the Clone Army ordered in Master Sifo Dyas' name 10 years prior to Episode 2? Why is that the same time that Sifo Dyas dies? Isn't this roughly the same time period that Dooku left the Order? Wasn't Dooku friends with Sifo Dyas? Is nothing suspicious about this at all! It took 10 years to create the first million clone troopers, which is oddly prescient given the galaxy erupts into civil war right when the first troops are ready. Given the level of precision, surely this would have made someone think twice. Who even funded the Clone Army? Surely the Jedi just don't have a tab open on Kamino for whenever they need to copy a person. Obviously they don't, since they didn't know Kamino existed until Episode 2. And not just the clones, but what about the creation of everything else? Arms, armor, tanks, vessels, everything else related to logistics. Where did that come from? How did no one notice a movement of so many resources as the creation of fleets and firearms, or food, I imagine Camino had limited food production capabilities, so millions of tons of grain and other foodstuffs would have had to come from somewhere. Even in an entire galaxy, I doubt all this can remain hidden for 10 years. Palpatine has been in office for a long time and consolidated a lot of power in the Chancellorship. Wait, someone observed that. The problem is, no one followed through on figuring out just how corrupt he was. They paid lip service noticing his corruption without actually trying to do something about it. So modern politics in a nutshell. Are you really telling me the Jedi never studied the clones? They never tried to look deeper to understand them? I know the Republic has a medical corps, but the Jedi were a part of it, and no Jedi ever saw an X-ray of a clone's head. In the cartoon, the Clone Trooper 5s fights harder to learn about the chips in their heads than the Collective Jedi Order does, trusting mysterious Kaminoans over the guy freaking out about the chip actually in his brain. The prequels were an opportunity. Not only could they tell the backstory of the Skywalker family and Obi-Wan Kenobi, but they could show off more of the Star Wars universe. Not just new settings and aliens, but they could show off those things that have been created since Return of the Jedi, particularly in the realm of technology. Here was a chance to see the older models of ships that dominated warfare before the Galactic Empire. There's a plethora of ideas to build off of. Dreadnought heavy cruisers, Z-95 headhunters, Victory Star Destroyers, the Y-Wing, or the disc-shaped cannons used on Hoth back in their heyday. There was so much potential there, and George Lucas pissed it all away. Instead, we got ships like this, and this. Cool designs, certainly. I'm fond of the Venator Star Destroyer myself, but more akin to the imaginings of a 5-year-old me than an actual adult trying to make military technology. Take the ARC 170 there. I could see it trying to be a precursor to the X-Wing, but not only is the Z-95 a more logical step backwards, the 170 is a really bad design. Why is there a split wing? They don't need to widen the fighter's field of fire or seem to have any other obvious purpose. Why are the engines so big? They're just a really vulnerable vital system. But wait, what about the Y-Wing, you might say? The Y-Wing bomber, a type of ship that carries heavier payloads in order to break hard targets, additional weight which might require more substantial power to propel. What about the Eta-2? I presume that it's supposed to be some pre-TIE fighter, but I don't see why that was necessary. The TIE was distinctly an Imperial vessel made by the Empire for its war strategies. Those strategies clearly don't predate the Empire, as the Republic fights more like the Rebel Alliance. Why would they need small craft with seemingly pointless opening flaps? And the Venator. Love it as I do, why does it have a giant dorsal hangar bay? Shall I count all the ways in which that is a stupid design choice? Especially for a frontline combat vessel? It's even worse than the large flank bays on Mon Calamari cruisers. And at least those were converted civilian ships. And what about all this? Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Separatist Joe? Shamelessly ripping off a gag from a more famous YouTuber aside, I appreciate George Lucas's creative impulse. I really do. But armies of droids is too much. There was never any prior indication that droids comprised entire armies. Most of the droids we had seen on film served some sort of secondary utility. C-3PO as a translator, R2-D2 as a mechanic, 2-1B as a medic. Heck, this guy is a walking battery! The only combat-oriented droid we see in all of the original trilogy is IG-88, a highly illegal assassin droid. In the expanded universe, combat droids cropped up as either security units or large, heavily armed support platforms. Thus, the idea that the Separatists fielded large forces of droids, from regular infantry to vehicles to starfighters, feels a tad far-fetched. Indeed, one of the selling points of the clone army is that clones, or more to the point, living, thinking people, are superior to droids. That the Separatists would continue to use droids, even when they demonstrated the tactical inferiority in the first battle of the war, defies logic. Another point to keep in mind is that the prequels added a whole slew of new technology to the Star Wars universe. All this technology proceeded to disappear in the 20 years between episodes 3 and 4. Obvious real-world reasons account for this, of course, but what about in-universe? Given that all this military surplus ought to be lying around on hundreds, not 1,000 or 2 worlds, surely the Rebel Alliance would be using some of it. It's not inconceivable to think the Rebels would find derelict Separatist and Republic cruisers occasionally and fix them up. Arms and armor would also be helpful. With some adjustment, a suit of clone armor would make a good stormtrooper disguise at a distance. Even the regular droids would be helpful. Surely some were merely damaged. Given the manpower concerns of the Alliance, refurbished Separatist droids could easily serve in myriad minor capacities or in combat roles. At the very least, they could provide us spare parts of scrap. Instead, there's little to no evidence much of this past technology existed. Did anyone actually ever stop and think about what the Separatists were all about? The only sense that you get of the film's antagonist organization is that it's controlled by evil, powerful corporations and the Sith. Outside of a couple of lines about corruption within the Republic, no real motivation is given outside of apparent political commentary about big business. But there had to be something there to cause hundreds of systems and sectors, it's never really made clear whether it's systems or sectors, to feel that they had legitimate reason to leave the Republic. The only visible face we get of the Separatists is the corporations and the Sith. Because everything is droid-controlled, we don't get to see the faces of regular people or of other leaders, people who might be true believers in a political movement. Not only will the majority of people probably not follow big companies into battle, but big companies probably would never start political movements outside of lobbying their own interests, whatever those might be. Starting a war where you're one of the combatants is probably not that good for business. The Clone Wars cartoon touches briefly on this, showing that the Confederacy does in fact have a Senate and citizens to worry about. Yet it never addresses how much these people know about the dubious character and morality of their leadership, nor does anyone ever address the morality of the war itself. The Confederacy seems to exist for the sole purpose of being fought by the Republic. The Separatist crisis amounts to a flimsy excuse to create a massive war for the sake of a couple of movies. Even the Empire had more depth to it. It was abundantly clear the Empire and people under it were fighting for order, their version of order. Who were the Separatists? Did they want to form an independent government? Did they all want to go their separate individual ways? Were they simply a protest movement gone too far? Anything would have been better than making them hollow cartoon villains. Never once do the movies address the ethics of human cloning. Never at any point does anyone stop and ponder the implications of growing people en masse for the sole purpose of fighting. The clones are found, war erupts, and the entire galaxy seemingly forgets that clones were made secretly for no obvious reason because they're a handy tool that needs to be used in that moment. Not even the Jedi, supposed arbiters of justice, seem to give the clones their due. They treat millions of living, breathing men like they're tools of warfare rather than ascension. Certainly they respect the clones' abilities, befriending and putting their trust in the soldiers, but they don't pause to think either. Certainly clones must give off some feeling in the Force, at the very least. Worse yet, outside of a small number of Republic military officers, the clones seem to have been trained to do all the jobs in the military. They never fight side by side with volunteers and conscripts from the multi-trillion population of the Republic. There are no mechanics recruited from the Corps, no ace pilots from the colonies. No one suggests that the clones aren't expected to fight for no other reason than they exist. It suggests that few in the galaxy are actually willing to fight for the Republic, despite it apparently being worth saving. A few episodes of the Clone Wars touches upon the clones' future, as they wonder what they'll have once the war is over. Rebels later expands on this, suggesting the clones are basically discarded for being obsolete at some point into the Emperor's reign. Even then, this huge ethical dilemma is only spared passing thoughts. Prior to the release of the prequels, my primary thoughts in the matters of who the clones were settled on the idea they are antagonists somehow, or perhaps that they fought under the banner of an antagonistic government threatening the Republic. That most certainly would have put the ethical dilemma front and center, like it wasn't in the movies. Even greater than that, it might have actually been addressed. Instead, the viewer is left confused, as the main characters of Star Wars are left looking less human for not addressing a very big elephant in the room. And that is my analysis of the Clone Wars. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that it was a bit of food for thought for you. I know that it seems a bit dated, given that it's been over 10 years since Episode 3 came out. But when analyzing literature and television and film, analysis never really goes out of style. The idea of looking back and trying to understand what you've seen, what you've read, what you've experienced. Was the Clone Wars a worthwhile experience, is the question I'm basically asking here. In my honest opinion, yes. The Clone Wars we see is a worthwhile experience, particularly through the television series, the cartoon series made by Lucas Animation. That's not to say that it didn't have deficiencies of George Lucas's making, as much of its problems sourced from the original creations of George Lucas. George Lucas's obsession with creating cool things rather than smart and intelligent things hampered the Clone Wars as an idea, as an event within Star Wars, as my voice decides to die in that very moment. Obviously, there's only so much that can be done. Obviously, George Lucas probably would have had to make some unique elements in order to make the Clone Wars work. But there's so much to explore, and there's so many aspects of the war that demand attention, that George Lucas ultimately drops the ball on it. Ultimately, in creating the Clone Wars the way he did, he fails to really serve the audience of Star Wars a really deep and meaningful conflict. It's a conflict that looks cool and has a lot of cool things in it, but cool isn't enough. It needs to actually grab you. It needs to actually move you. It needs to have a heart. Without that heart, a heart that the Clone Wars cartoon series eventually adds in with excellent storylines, such as the Umbara arc in the 4th season, I believe, that really grabs and moves you and makes you feel and understand the Clone Wars on a deeper level. That should have been in the movies, and it wasn't. And Star Wars is a less rich experience for it. At any rate, thank you for listening to this analysis, and I will catch you next time, as I probably analyze something else related to Star Wars. Maybe. We'll see. Until next time, everybody!